I found HOA Karen's Mercedes in my workshop, so I welded the doors shut. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, we would like to ask you for one small favor. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss any of our latest videos. It only takes a moment, costs nothing, and is one of the best ways to help us continue creating powerful, emotional, and dramatic stories like this one. Your support means more to us than you can imagine. Also, let us know where you are watching from today. Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let us return to our main character. You welded my Mercedes shut? Lorraine Whitmore screamed from behind the yellow safety line, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hiss of cooling steel. I lifted my welding hood and looked at the white SUV trapped inside the rectangular frame I had built around it. Blue smoke curled toward the rafters. The air smelled like hot iron, machine oil, and the expensive perfume Lorraine had carried into my father's workshop without permission. Red and blue lights flashed across the corrugated walls as two county patrol cars rolled up my private drive. Lorraine slapped one hand against the chain-link gate and pointed at me with the other. Arrest him. He destroyed a $100,000 vehicle. I set the torch on my steel table, pulled off my leather gloves, and listened to the last weld tick as it cooled. She thought the Mercedes was the most valuable thing inside my shop. She was wrong by about $4 million. My name is Caleb Mercer, and until that morning, most people in Briar Glen knew me as the guy with soot on his boots and metal shavings in his truck. I own Mercer Fabrication, a 40-year-old welding shop my father built when this land was still soybean fields and gravel roads. The neighborhood came later. The HOA came much later. Lorraine came 6 months ago and acted like she had been born holding a clipboard. She drove that white Mercedes GLS through the subdivision like a governor inspecting her territory, windows tinted, chrome spotless, vanity plate reading Boss HOA. Every Tuesday, she passed my shop slowly enough to count the trucks in the yard. Every Wednesday, another violation notice appeared in my mailbox. Excessive noise, commercial traffic, unapproved fencing, industrial appearance. The paper always smelled faintly of her perfume. I kept every notice in the blue steel cabinet my father left beside the drafting table. He had scratched 5 words into the wood above it years ago. Measure twice. Trust paper once. At 4:18 that morning, my security system had sent an alert. The camera above the south beam showed Lorraine unlocking my gate with a copied key. Her maintenance manager, Darren Cole, cut the secondary chain and pulled the side door open. Then Lorraine drove her Mercedes straight into my shop and parked it over a red line painted across the concrete floor. That line marked an old county water access point my father had warned me never to block. They stood beside the hood and spoke like the building already belonged to them. Darren asked whether emergency use would be enough. Lorraine said 30 days of documented access could establish control. Then she left the keys in her purse, locked my office, and walked out smiling. By sunrise, I had called my attorney, the sheriff's office, and the county utilities inspector. I had also measured 12 lengths of 2-inch square tubing. Now Lorraine stood outside watching the truth cool around her car. One deputy approached me carefully. "Mr. Mercer, did you weld anything to the vehicle?" I looked at Lorraine, then at the steel cage anchored only to my own fabrication rack. "Not 1 inch," I said. "But nobody is moving that car until the county sees what she parked it on." The deputy followed my eyes to the red stripe beneath the Mercedes. It was only 4 inches wide, faded at the edges, and covered with 40 years of scars from dropped tools and rolling steel. To Lorraine, it probably looked like old paint. To me, it was part of the shop's memory. My father had laid that line down in 1986, back when the nearest subdivision was 7 miles away and the road outside was still crushed limestone. He told me never to stack equipment across it, never to bolt machinery over it, and never to let anyone convince me it was useless. At the time, I was 11 years old and more interested in the sparks jumping from his torch than the reason behind the warning. Walter Mercer believed every mark in a working shop had a purpose. He built Mercer Fabrication with a borrowed welder, a used drill press, and the kind of patience that made stubborn steel seem reasonable. Farmers brought him broken gates. Contractors brought him cracked trailers. County crews brought him pump housings nobody else wanted to touch. I grew up sweeping metal shavings from the concrete and learning that clean work started long before the first arc struck. By 16, I could read a fabrication drawing. By 21, I could build from one. By 30, I was running half the jobs while Dad handled customers from the scarred oak desk near the office window. The shop sat on 3.5 acres that had belonged to my family since 1979. The deed covered the building, the gravel service road, the drainage ditch, and a narrow utility easement that crossed the southern wall. When Dad died 6 years ago, he left me everything, including the blue steel cabinet no one else had permission to open. Inside were permits, survey maps, county letters, inspection tags, and handwritten notes in his blocky pencil script. Most people saw old paper. Dad saw armor. The HOA had not existed when he built the place. Briar Glen arrived in phases, first 12 homes, then 40, then a clubhouse with fake stone columns and a fountain that ran even during drought restrictions. The houses crept closer every year until my shop looked like an island of corrugated metal in a sea of beige siding. I stayed because the land was paid for, the zoning was grandfathered, and every beam above my head carried my father's fingerprints. The cameras came later. I installed 4 of them after tools started disappearing from unlocked trailers along the county road. They were hardwired, locally recorded, and completely separate from the neighborhood network Lorraine kept bragging about. One watched the front gate. One covered the south door. One faced the welding floor. The last sat above the red line. Lorraine had no idea that her copied. He, Darren's bolt cutters, and every word they spoke beside that Mercedes had been recorded from 3 angles. The deputy asked how long I had owned the property. I reached into the cabinet and handed him the original deed. The paper felt rough and dry between my fingers. Lorraine stopped shouting when she saw the county seal. For the first time that morning, the shop became quiet enough to hear the old wall clock ticking above my father's desk. Lorraine Whitmore did not arrive in Briar Glen quietly. She arrived in a white Mercedes with polished wheels, dark windows, and a vanity plate that read Boss HOA. 6 months earlier, she had walked into the clubhouse wearing a cream-colored suit and carrying a leather binder thick enough to stop a door. By the end of that meeting, she had replaced the old board president, formed 3 new committees, and promised to protect property values from what she called visual decline. Everyone applauded because her words sounded clean and expensive. I knew better the first time she looked at my workshop. She stood beside the subdivision fountain with one hand, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun, and stared across the drainage ditch at my corrugated steel building. The wind carried the smell of fresh mulch from the clubhouse beds, but even from 50 yards away, her perfume reached me first. She crossed the service road without asking and stopped outside my open bay door while I was welding a cracked trailer frame. The torch hissed. Blue sparks bounced across the concrete. She waited until I lifted my hood, then gave me the kind of smile real estate agents use when they have already decided what your property is worth. She introduced herself as the new HOA president and said she was conducting a neighborhood standards review. I told her the shop was outside HOA boundaries. She glanced at my work boots, the grease on my sleeves, and the old Ford parked beside the scrap rack. Then she said the building still affected community presentation. That was Lorraine's favorite trick. She turned opinions into policies by lowering her voice and speaking slowly. She pointed at my steel inventory, my service trucks, and the sign above. The office door. She called them industrial clutter. I called them the reason 12 families got paychecks every Friday. 2 days later, the first notice arrived. Excessive commercial activity. The next week brought another for unapproved exterior materials. Then came one for noise, even though my county permit allowed fabrication from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. Each envelope carried the same embossed HOA logo and the same faint trace of her perfume. I answered every notice with copies of zoning records, permits, and the original property map. Lorraine never acknowledged the documents. She simply changed the complaint. At the next board meeting, she displayed a photograph of my shop on a large screen and called it a stain on Briar Glen's eastern entrance. I sat in the back row while neighbors shifted in their folding chairs and avoided looking at me. Lorraine proposed that the HOA purchase my land for community redevelopment. Her offer was less than half its assessed value. I declined before she finished reading the number. Her smile stayed in place, but her fingers tightened around the remote until her knuckles turned pale. After the meeting, she followed me into the parking lot. Sprinklers clicked across the lawn. Water tapped against the Mercedes like light rain. She told me old permissions could be corrected and outdated businesses could be relocated. I looked past her at the spotless hood reflecting the clubhouse lights. Then I told her my father built the shop before Briar Glen existed, and it would still be standing after her term ended. That was the moment the paperwork stopped being annoying and started becoming personal. The first vehicle appeared 3 mornings later. It was a green landscaping truck with the Briar Glen logo on the door, rolling down my private gravel road before sunrise. The tires crushed loose stone with a slow, deliberate grind. I stepped outside holding a mug of coffee and watched the driver pass the sign that said private access. He did not slow down. He parked beside my steel inventory, unloaded 2 commercial mowers, and told me Lorraine had approved the area as temporary community storage. I told him. Lorraine did not own a single inch of that road. He shrugged, checked something on his phone, and said he was only following the work order. By the end of the week, temporary storage had become a fuel trailer, 3 trash barrels, and a locked tool chest sitting against my south wall. Darren Cole started showing up every afternoon in a gray pickup with magnetic HOA signs on both doors. Darren was the maintenance manager Lorraine had hired after replacing the old contractor. He wore clean work gloves that never seemed to touch dirt and carried a ring of keys large enough to belong to a jailer. The first time I confronted him, he smiled and said the board was clarifying shared access responsibilities. I asked him to clarify them somewhere else. The next morning, the chain on my gate had been removed and replaced with a keypad lock. A yellow card was taped to the post with a temporary access code printed beneath the HOA logo. My own gate. My own road. Their code. The metal tasted cold against my fingers when I examined the new latch. I called the county sheriff. Deputy Marston arrived 20 minutes later, walked the property line with me, and listened while Darren claimed the road served emergency maintenance functions for the subdivision. Then Darren produced a laminated map. My shop, yard, and service road were shaded pale blue and labeled Common Operations Corridor. I had never seen that document before. The deputy frowned at it, then at my deed. He said the papers conflicted and advised both sides to settle the matter in civil court. Lorraine arrived before he left. Her Mercedes glided over the gravel without a speck of dust on the hood. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and carrying the same leather binder from the board meeting. Her perfume mixed with diesel fumes from the landscaping truck. She thanked the deputy as though he worked for her, then explained that Briar Glen had recently discovered historic maintenance rights connected to my parcel. I asked where those rights had been hiding for 40 years. She opened the binder and showed me a copied signature at the bottom of an attachment dated 1998. Walter Mercer. My father's name. The letters were close, but the first stroke of the W curved left. Dad always started his W with 3 hard downward lines. I had watched him sign invoices thousands of times. Lorraine closed the binder before I could take the page. She said certified copies would be available after legal review. That afternoon, I removed the keypad and reinstalled my chain. The following morning, it was cut again. Then an HOA security camera appeared on a utility pole facing directly into my open bay. I climbed a ladder, disconnected it, placed it carefully in a cardboard box, and delivered it to the clubhouse front desk with a receipt. Lorraine responded by sending me a $500 fine for tampering with community safety equipment. The paper smelled like toner and roses. I filed it in the blue cabinet beside the others. By then, I understood the pattern. She was not trying to enforce rules. She was building a paper trail that made trespassing look routine, shared use look established, and my objections look unreasonable. Every truck, every lock, every false notice was another brick in a wall she planned to build around my property. What Lorraine did not understand was that walls work both ways. They can keep owners out, or they can keep evidence in. The storm warning came on a Thursday afternoon, 20 minutes before closing. Hail the size of golf balls was moving east across the county, and every phone in the shop lit up with the same emergency alert. My crew rolled the service trucks beneath the rear canopy, covered the finished railings, and lowered the steel shutters over the office windows. By 6, the wind had picked up enough to push dust beneath the bay door. I checked the south gate twice before I left. The chain was locked. The side entrance was deadbolt. The red line across the concrete floor was clear. At 4:18 the next morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected. Southgate. The screen showed Lorraine's Mercedes idling outside my fence, white paint glowing under the security light. Darren climbed out of the passenger side carrying bolt cutters. The sound came through the camera microphone a second later, one hard metallic snap, followed by the chain dropping onto gravel. Lorraine drove through before the gate had finished swinging open. Darren unlocked the side door with a key I had never given him, and the two of them stepped into my workshop like they were arriving for an appointment. The wind rattled the roof panels overhead. Rain tapped against the windows. Lorraine walked between my machines with her phone raised, recording every corner. Then she pointed toward the red stripe and told Darren that was where she wanted the vehicle. He hesitated. Even through the camera, I could hear him say the floor marking might mean something. Lorraine told him it meant nothing if no one enforced it. She backed the Mercedes onto the steel fabrication rack until all four tires rested inside the rectangular frame. The right rear will stop directly above the Old County access plate. Darren placed 2 orange cones near the bumper, then taped a notice to my welding table. Emergency Community Use Authorization. The paper claimed the HOA had temporarily taken control of my building to protect neighborhood assets from severe weather. My shop was not listed as a shelter. It was not listed as shared property. The only neighborhood asset inside was Lorraine's car. She smoothed the notice with both hands, looked around the empty room, and laughed softly. Then Darren asked the question that changed everything. How long do we need to keep using it? Lorraine leaned against the hood of the Mercedes and answered without lowering her voice. 30 days gives us a pattern. After that, we show continuous access, maintenance responsibility, and emergency necessity. By the time Mercer gets a hearing, the board will already control the corridor. Darren asked about the forged attachment. Lorraine told him not to call it that. She said the developer's attorney had cleaned up the language and the sale would close once the access issue disappeared. The storm had not even reached Briar Glen. There was no emergency. This was paperwork with headlights. I saved the footage to 3 separate drives before putting on my boots. By 5:10, I was standing at the gate with rain running off my jacket and the cut chain cold in my palm. The side door smelled of wet asphalt, machine oil, and Lorraine's perfume. Her Mercedes sat beneath the hanging work lights, spotless and silent, blocking the one section of floor my father had warned me never to cover. The orange cones were positioned carefully for photographs. The authorization notice waited on my table as if it expected obedience. I read every line, then turned it over. On the back, faintly visible through the paper, was part of an email Darren had printed on the same office machine. It mentioned a development agreement, a utility corridor, and a payment of $4 million. I did not touch the car. I did not move the cones. I photographed the cut lock, the copied key marks, the tire positions, and the document from every angle. Then I called my attorney, the sheriff's office, and county utilities. Lorraine had entered my shop to manufacture a claim. Instead, she had parked the most expensive witness in the county directly on top of the truth. The county utilities inspector arrived at 7:12 in a mud-splashed pickup with an amber light bar on the roof. Her name was Marjorie Keene, and she had the steady expression of someone who trusted measurements more than explanations. She stopped at the red stripe, crouched beside the Mercedes, and brushed dust from a round steel plate beneath the rear axle. The county seal appeared under her glove. Lorraine had parked directly over a protected access vault. Marjorie asked for every record connected to the property. I opened the blue cabinet and started laying folders across my father's desk. The paper smelled dry and metallic, like old tools stored through winter. Survey maps, inspection letters, utility permits, a maintenance agreement dated 1986. Near the bottom of the third folder, I found a folded county map with a red pencil line running beneath the workshop. It marked an emergency water main connecting 2 reservoirs on opposite sides of Briar Glen. The access vault under Lorraine's car controlled a shutoff valve large enough to isolate the eastern branch during a rupture. My father had not painted that stripe as a reminder for himself. The county required a 10-foot clearance around the plate at all times. Marjorie read the agreement twice, then pointed to a clause in the margin. My family owned the surface property, but only the county and the recorded landowner could authorize access. No homeowners association, developer, or private contractor had any standing there. Blocking the vault without approval carried civil penalties. Using it to support a real estate transaction could trigger something much worse. I showed her the faint email visible through the back of Lorraine's notice. She held it under the desk lamp and adjusted the angle. The words became clearer. Bramble Ridge Development. Eastern Utility Corridor. $4 million access consideration. The humming fluorescent light suddenly sounded louder. My attorney, Samuel Price, arrived 10 minutes later carrying a legal pad and a travel mug. He watched the security footage without speaking. When Lorraine mentioned 30 days of continuous access, he paused the video and wrote one sentence. Attempted prescriptive use through manufactured occupancy. Then he replayed Darren's question about the attachment and Lorraine's warning not to call it forged. Samuel looked at me over the rim of his glasses. She is not trying to take the shop, he said. She is trying to sell what lies under it. The offer Lorraine had made at the board meeting finally made sense. She did not want the corrugated building, the gravel road, or my welding equipment. She wanted control of the only legal entry point to a water corridor a developer needed for hundreds of new homes. $4 million would pass through the HOA, and no one had explained where it would go after that. I searched the remaining folders until I found my father's original signature page. Walter Mercer's W dropped in 3 straight strokes, exactly as I remembered. Lorraine's copy curved like handwriting from a greeting card. Marjorie photographed both documents beside a ruler and county evidence tag. Samuel drafted a formal demand ordering the vehicle removed by 6 that evening. We sent it by certified courier, electronic mail, and hand delivery to the clubhouse. At 9:30, Lorraine replied that the Mercedes would remain until the board completed its emergency facilities review. She also warned me not to interfere with authorized community property. I read her message twice, then looked at the steel fabrication rack surrounding the vehicle. The rack belonged to me. The floor belonged to me. The shop belonged to me. The car did not. I called Samuel and asked one careful question. Could I secure my own work zone without touching her property? He spoke with the deputy and Marjorie before answering. I could establish a safety barrier, preserve the scene, and prevent unauthorized movement while the county inspected the vault, provided nothing was attached to the Mercedes. I put the phone down and measured the distance between the rack posts. 92 inches. Then I pulled 12 lengths of 2-inch square tubing from storage. My father's words sat above the desk in faded black letters. Measure twice. Trust paper once. For the first time since Lorraine entered my life, I was no longer reacting to her plan. I was building the end of it. I started with the rack beneath the Mercedes. It was a 12-foot steel platform I had built for securing truck frames during restoration work, rated for more weight than Lorraine's polished sport utility vehicle could ever put on it. Every anchor point belonged to me. Every upright rested outside the body panels. I measured the clearance from the mirrors twice, then added 4 inches. The tape measure snapped back into its case with a clean metallic click. By noon, the first vertical post stood at each corner. I welded crossbars between them, keeping the heat far from the paint. The arc flashed blue against the white bodywork. Hot steel gave off that sharp electric smell that settles at the back of your throat. Each bead joined my tubing to my rack, never to her vehicle. Samuel watched from beside the office with a printed copy of the deputy's written guidance in his hand. Marjorie remained near the red stripe, documenting the position of the county access plate every 20 minutes. I mounted 4 horizontal bars at door height, close enough to prevent any door from opening, but far enough to leave the Mercedes untouched. Then I placed wheel stops around all 4 tires and locked them to the rack. The car had become the center of a steel room with no usable exit. It looked dramatic. That was the point Lorraine would focus on. The legal details were what mattered. At 1:30, the certified courier returned with a signed delivery receipt from the clubhouse. Lorraine had accepted the removal demand herself. At 2:14, she sent another message refusing to move the vehicle. She claimed the HOA had assumed temporary custody of the workshop and warned that disrupting the emergency arrangement would result in personal liability. Samuel printed the message and placed it beside the forged attachment. Another sheet for the growing stack. Another choice she could not take back. I mounted a bright orange sign on the front bar. County Utility Inspection Area. Unauthorized vehicle. Evidence hold. The wording came directly from Marjorie. Beneath it, I attached a clear plastic sleeve containing the removal notices, the delivery receipt, the safety plan, and a diagram showing every weld location. No one could honestly claim they had not been warned. At 3, Darren's pickup slowed outside the gate. He stared through the fence, lifted his phone, and drove away. 20 minutes later, Lorraine called. Her voice came through the shop speaker smooth at first, then brittle when I refused to remove the bars. She said I had no authority to imprison community property. I reminded her that the Mercedes was privately registered in her name. The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then she said the board's attorney would have me arrested. I told her to bring him. At 5:40, I tested every camera. The front gate feed showed the gravel road. The south camera showed the cut chain. The welding floor camera captured the entire rack. The fourth camera stared directly down at the red line and the county seal beneath the rear axle. I copied the recordings again and handed one drive to Samuel and another to Marjorie. The original stayed locked in my father's cabinet. Sunset turned the high windows orange. The steel bars cast long shadows across the Mercedes doors. I shut down the welder and listened to the frame cool, each soft tick, sounding like a clock counting toward something Lorraine still believed she controlled. At 6:02, the removal deadline passed. At 6:05, headlights appeared at the end of my private road. The white Mercedes remained exactly where she had left it, sealed inside my work zone, resting above the one piece of evidence her $4 million deal could not survive. The first headlights belonged to Lorraine's attorney, a silver sedan rolling over the gravel with its hazard lights blinking. Behind it came 2 patrol cars, a county vehicle, and a local news van with a roof antenna folded flat against the wind. Lorraine stepped out before anyone else had fully parked. She wore the same cream suit from her first board meeting, but the calm had vanished. Her heels sank slightly into the damp gravel as she pointed through the open bay and shouted that I had destroyed her Mercedes. The news camera swung toward the steel frame. Red and blue light moved across the white paint in slow bands. From the road, it looked exactly the way she wanted it to look, a luxury vehicle trapped behind fresh welds. She marched to the yellow line and demanded that the deputies arrest me for criminal damage. Deputy Marston raised one hand and asked whether she had received the removal notice. Lorraine said that question was irrelevant. Samuel stepped forward with the signed courier receipt. The paper snapped softly in the evening breeze. Marston read the signature, checked the time, then asked whether she had refused to move the vehicle. Lorraine said the HOA had lawful emergency control of the building. That was when Marjorie opened the clear sleeve attached to the front bar and handed him the county inspection order. The shop went quiet except for the low hum of the lights. One deputy walked around the rack with a flashlight. He checked each upright, each crossbar, and every inch of clearance around the Mercedes. No weld touched the doors. No bracket touched the frame. No chain touched the wheels. The steel cage was attached only to my fabrication platform. Lorraine kept talking until Marston asked her to stop. Then I turned on the monitor above my father's desk. The first recording showed Darren cutting the chain. The second showed Lorraine entering with a copied key. The third showed her parking over the red line. Her own voice filled the workshop, clear and confident, explaining that 30 days of continuous access would help the board claim control. The reporter lowered her microphone and stared at Lorraine. Samuel played the next clip. Darren asked about the forged attachment. Lorraine warned him not to use that word. Her attorney's face changed first. He looked down at the gravel, closed his briefcase, and stepped away from her. Then Marjorie displayed the utility map. She traced the emergency water main beneath the building and explained that the access vault served 2 reservoirs and 3 residential zones. Blocking it without authorization was already a serious violation. Attempting to sell access rights that belonged to the county and recorded landowner was something else entirely. Lorraine called the map outdated. I placed my father's signature page beside her attachment. 3 hard strokes in the original W. 1 curved imitation on hers. Darren arrived while the deputies were comparing them. He stopped near the gate, saw the cameras, and seemed to understand the situation before anyone spoke to him. Lorraine ordered him to explain that the documents had been approved. Darren looked at her, then at the steel frame around the Mercedes. His shoulders dropped. He said the developer's attorney had sent the draft, but Lorraine had instructed him to attach Walter Mercer's signature from an old invoice. She had promised the board would control the corridor before closing. Lorraine moved toward the driver's side and demanded that the bars be removed immediately. Marston told her the vehicle would remain in place until the county completed its evidence photographs. She reached for the door handle anyway. The door moved less than an inch before stopping against the crossbar. The sound was small, just a muted click, but every camera captured it. For months, Lorraine had used paperwork, titles, and polished confidence to make trespassing look official. Now all of it was standing under fluorescent lights, measured, recorded, and unable to leave. The county finished photographing the vault just after midnight. By then, the news van was gone. The deputies had collected the forged attachment, and Lorraine's attorney had stopped answering her questions. The Mercedes remained inside the steel frame for 3 more days while investigators copied the recordings and traced the development agreement. I did not touch a single bar until Marjorie handed me a written release. The consequences arrived quietly at first. Briar Glen's board called an emergency meeting and removed Lorraine as president by a unanimous vote. The $4 million corridor deal was suspended before the developer could transfer, as Cent County auditors found that Lorraine had approved payments to a consulting company registered to her brother-in-law, all under the label of infrastructure planning. Darren agreed to cooperate and admitted he had changed maps, copied keys, and created work orders at Lorraine's direction. The prosecutor filed charges for document fraud, attempted property fraud, and unlawful entry. No dramatic speech, no shouting. Just signatures, stamped pages, and doors closing one after another. The HOA's fines against me disappeared within a week. Every notice in my blue cabinet was formally withdrawn. The board reimbursed my legal expenses, replaced the cut locks, removed the camera pole, and signed a permanent agreement recognizing that my road, yard, and workshop were outside their authority. The county offered Mercer Fabrication a maintenance contract for the emergency valve access, the same piece of infrastructure Lorraine had tried to turn into private profit. My father had protected that corridor for decades without making a show of it. Now his name was printed on the agreement beside mine. On Friday morning, Marjorie, Samuel, and Deputy Marston returned for the release. Sunlight came through the high windows and stretched across the concrete. Lorraine stood near the gate with a licensed transport driver, silent for once. Her Mercedes was still spotless except for a faint mark near the driver's handle where she had forced the door against the bar. I rolled the cutting cart into position and lowered my face. Shield. The saw bit into the first crossbar with a bright spray of sparks. It fell onto the rack with a heavy clang. The first bar sounded like every false fine being canceled. The second sounded like the board vote removing her name from the office door. The third dropped after the county confirmed the development deal was dead. When I cut the final bar, the frame opened cleanly around the vehicle without leaving so much as a scorch mark on the paint. Lorraine walked forward and inspected every door, every window, every polished panel. She had arrived expecting damage she could use against me. There was none. Deputy Marston handed the keys to the transport driver because the vehicle still had to be processed as evidence before it could be released to her. Lorraine looked at me across the rack. The perfume was still there, but the authority had drained out of her voice. She asked whether all of this had really been necessary. I looked at the cut chain hanging beside the gate, then at my father's 5 words above the desk. Measure twice. Trust paper once. I told her she had been given 3 notices, 1 deadline, and every opportunity to move the car herself. She had mistaken patience for weakness and paperwork for ownership. The transport driver backed the Mercedes out slowly. Its tires crossed the red stripe one final time, then rolled onto the gravel road it had never had permission to use. When the sound faded, I swept the steel filings into a dustpan and placed the forged attachment in the empty folder where Lorraine's fines had been. I never welded her car shut. I welded her story in place long enough for the truth to catch up.